All right, welcome to New Testament Survey. As we begin our class, we're going to be looking into the intertestamental period, the time that is between the Old Testament and the New Testament. A period that covers around 400 to 420 years and begins sometime around 425, about the time the book of Malachi was written, and a period of time of Jesus' birth, or the announcement of the birth of John the Baptist, sometime around 4 or 5 BC. So sometime around 400 to 420 years. This time period covers a lot of Earth's history. A lot of things are going on. In fact, the Old Testament, the period of the Old Testament, looks drastically different than the period and the culture that surrounds the New Testament. And many people who simply just pick up the Bible and don't have any of that cultural or historical context in mind really don't understand why there's such a difference between what's going on in the Old Testament and what's going on in the New Testament. But so as we do this, what I want to begin with is I'm just going to be looking at a couple of maps here, looking at a couple of the world empires that shaped the world between the Old and New Testaments. And we begin with what is generally considered the first true global empire, and that's the empire of the Assyrians. The Assyrians defeated the northern kingdom of Israel sometime around 721 BC. We can see that in the book of 2 Kings and 1 Chronicles. 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And then eventually became a world power. And this world power of the Assyrians covers an area that is considered Mesopotamia, or the area of the Fertile Crescent. So you can see on our map here the areas between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, spanning from basically the Persian Gulf, or what's called the Lower Sea on our map here, and the Great Sea, or the Mediterranean Sea. This area of the world is where most of the world's population was centered around at that time. Now, the Assyrians were known for their brutality. In fact, what they would do is they would rule through fear. And when people would want to rise up against them, they would make an example of them by torturing their kings and their generals, and then they would display those people, many times even still alive, sometimes skinned alive, on the walls of the city. Now, it's the Assyrians, with their capital in Nineveh, who God called Jonah to go and witness against. So you can kind of see, wow, this is a pretty brutal group where Jonah was saying, I don't think these people deserve any kind of forgiveness or grace from God. And so he didn't want to go, not because he didn't think that God could save them, but rather because he knew that God would save them and redeem them. And so that's where the context of that book comes in. The Assyrians lasted for about until about 612 BC. In 612 BC, they were defeated by a group called the Babylonians. The Babylonian Empire, or sometimes called the Neo or New Babylonian Empire, because to differentiate it from the ancient Babylonians, which were in power sometime around the time of Abraham, really at the beginning of the New Testament, or beginning of the Old Testament. Their empire, as you can see, stretched again all the way from the Lower Sea, or the Persian Sea, all the way to the Great Sea through the Tigris and Euphrates River, but also really kind of went all the way up to Egypt, and also included Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah, because in 606, and really what ends up happening in 612, when Babylon defeats Nineveh, the Ninevites, or the Assyrians, escape to a place called Carchemish. And you can see that on our map there, right at the headwaters of the Euphrates River. And the Battle of Carchemish was a tremendous battle that took place between Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians. Nebuchadnezzar then, after he's defeated the Assyrians, marches south toward Jerusalem, and in 606 BC captures the city of Jerusalem and takes Daniel and his friends and the king of Israel captive to Babylon. And this was part of Nebuchadnezzar's style of rule, because Nebuchadnezzar recognized that you couldn't simply rule through fear, although he certainly used a lot of it. Part of his plan to rule the world was to bring everyone together in one place, that they would be worshiping the same God, worshiping in the same way. And so what we have in the book of Daniel, chapter 3, in chapter 2, where we see Daniel and his friends, or rather just the friends of Daniel, being forced to bow down to the golden image of Nebuchadnezzar, there in Daniel chapter 3. And this was very typical of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, not because he wanted people to worship him, but because ultimately, in order to rule the world, he figured that if everyone worshipped the same way and understood one another in that way, and then they would get along and he could rule them. Of course, that's not exactly what ends up happening. And after Nebuchadnezzar dies, the Babylonian Empire goes into a bit of disarray. Also want to mention, in 586, just 20 years after Daniel and his friends are taken, the city of Jerusalem is sacked again by Nebuchadnezzar, and the temple itself is destroyed. And as I said, the Babylonian Empire goes into a bit of disarray, and none of his descendants were nearly as politically astute as Nebuchadnezzar. And eventually, in 539, Babylon then falls to the Persians. Now, this is sometimes called the Medo-Persian Empire, or the Medes and the Persians. They rule from Susa, or Shushan, you see here on the list. And you can see that their empire spanned considerably larger than Babylon. And part of the way that they decided to rule was through law. And the law of the Medes and the Persians, we see a lot in the Old Testament, where they realized that people wanted to know that their king, the emperor, was not above the law. And whereas Nebuchadnezzar was the law, he was above the law, he stood above the law. But the Persian Empire, because the Medes and the Persians came together, they wanted to make sure that no emperor, no king would be above the law. And so they established the rule of the Medes and the Persians. Even though the emperor could establish law, he could not then break that law. And we see that happen several times in the book of Esther, and even in the book of Daniel. In both cases, they're confronted with the fact that the king had made a law, but then could not go back on that law. And that's a style that the Persians used to rule the world through the law itself. Then, after the Persians, you have the Greeks. And what you have here is all throughout the time that the Persians were ruling, they were battling on the Western Front, the Macedonians and the Greeks. We have the Peloponnesian Wars. We have several other wars that are going on in this time between Greeks and Persians, and until a young general, Macedonian general, takes over Greece named Alexander. Alexander, who is the son of the king of Macedon named Philip. And then you have Alexander the Great defeating the Persian Empire in 333 BC, there in the Battle of Issus, and then again traveling south through Palestine, or through Israel, taking over Egypt. And what's different about Alexander's empire is that he also ruled Egypt, even naming himself Pharaoh. Then continuing east through Babylon and through the Persian Empire, eventually conquering the entire world. He did this in a period of about 3 years. And Alexander the Great was a tremendous tactician. He was a tremendous war. He was a war general, and yet he died when he was about 33 years old, and left no heir and no way to divide up his empire. He had 4 or 6 major generals that ruled under him, and when he died, the empire was then broken up between those 4 generals, and we see that in these. You see the colored areas here between the Seleucid, that would be the general Seleucus, and then Ptolemies, or the Ptolemaic monarchy. The dark green there, where is Egypt. The light green, the Seleucids, and these 2 pertain mostly to Israel, because you see where that light green and the dark green come together is right in the middle of Israel. And because Jerusalem was a very tactical position, very strategic position, they fought over who should have control over Jerusalem, and went back and forth until eventually, and originally it was the Ptolemies, and then eventually the Seleucids took over, and in that, there we go, there's the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and eventually when the Seleucids took over that area, we have the rise of a person named Antiochus Epiphanes. And we're going to end this video right here, and in the next video we'll talk about Antiochus, and we'll talk about the Maccabean revolt.